It all started with a suite that wasn't supposed to be hers, a room so luxurious it looked like it belonged in a royal fantasy, not the reality of a junior marketing associate like Ava Mitchell. The front desk had apologized for the mix-up, but said the VIP suite was hers for the night, as a last-minute thank you from corporate for her tireless work on the Madison launch. And after the month she'd had, she wasn't about to question a gift wrapped in white marble, glass walls, and a skyline view that stole her breath. She'd never seen anything so perfect, so removed from the cluttered apartment she came home to every night, with its creaky fan and chipped mugs. She placed her bag on the velvet chaise by the window and wandered into the open bathroom, her fingers brushing against the smooth, polished counter as she let out a deep sigh, her shoulders finally relaxing. No one had ever called her lucky before, but tonight the universe had thrown her a break, and for the first time in weeks she felt like a woman, and not a name on a bottomless task list. She stepped in front of the large mirror, admiring the way the light touched her skin, soft and golden. Her fingertips toyed with the hem of her dress, and she hesitated, smiling shyly at her reflection. Then she began to undress, slowly, methodically, like it was a ritual of reclaiming herself. She didn't know that behind that mirror was something else entirely. On the other side of the wall, high above the city, in the private operations room of the hotel's surveillance wing, Leo Lancaster stood alone, eyes fixed on the small screen in front of him. This wasn't part of his plan. It was supposed to be his half-brother Damien in that suite tonight. Damien, who had made that specific room his unofficial office for over a year. Damien, who had guests he never logged, payments that never matched the records, and a trail of suspicion so carefully blurred it took Leo months to get internal security clearance to quietly install the special mirror cam. He hadn't meant to watch, hadn't even planned on being in the room tonight, but when his assistant mentioned the suite was unexpectedly reassigned, something told him to check. What he saw stopped him cold. It wasn't Damien. It wasn't any guest on the suspected list. It was a young woman with waves of brown hair and bare shoulders, standing with the kind of grace that didn't belong in a trap meant for corruption. She looked soft, unaware, and painfully human. She looked like everything this place had lost over years of power and money. He reached for the intercom, hesitated, then pulled back. His jaw clenched. He knew he had to turn the feed off, delete the footage, end it before she became part of this twisted war between brothers. But his hand wouldn't move. Something about her, the way she cradled her dress to her chest and exhaled like the weight of the world had finally lifted, made him feel like he'd stepped into a memory that wasn't his. Like she didn't belong in a scheme, she belonged in a story. He didn't know her name, didn't know how she ended up there. All he knew was that from this moment, everything was going to change. And it already had. Ava Mitchell was the kind of woman who moved quietly through life, unnoticed in crowds, overworked at meetings, always the last to leave the office and the first to answer emails. She'd grown up in Oregon in a 2-bedroom house her mother fought to keep after the divorce, and when she got the scholarship to Columbia, she swore she'd never go back to living small. But New York wasn't a fairy tale. It was rent paid late, ramen for dinner, and saying yes to every task just to be seen. She'd landed a junior role at Blackwell & Pierce after 6 rounds of interviews, a company known more for its ruthless takeovers than employee compassion. And for the past year, she'd been just another shadow in a glossy building where power hummed through marble floors and silence was survival. Her only joy came from her work ethic, her 1-bedroom in Queens, and her journal where she wrote stories that would never be read. She didn't know the suite on the 59th floor was tied to something deeper. She didn't know it had been secretly under surveillance for months by the very man who signed her bonus slip, Leo Lancaster, the elusive heir to Lancaster International, a name whispered in boardrooms and magazine covers. A man who avoided press but owned half the skyline and the secrets it kept. To the world, Leo was cold, brilliant, untouchable, but behind the fortress of private security and investor summits was a son raised on conditional love, a child of divorce caught in a war of inheritance and grudges. His half-brother Damien had been a thorn in his side since they were boys, charming but reckless, using the family name like a golden ticket with no sense of consequence. Leo had spent his adult life cleaning up Damien's messes, and now it had gone too far. Damien had been using the suite for deals that never touched paper, meetings that left no digital trace, guests who didn't sign the lobby log, and Leo suspected he was planning to leak company assets to outside bidders through a woman named Claudine, who was supposed to show up that night. Instead, it was Ava, with no agenda, no plan, just a worn-out heart, and a keycard she thought was meant for her. Leo had spent the last 6 months watching patterns, building quiet cases, consulting with internal compliance under the radar, and when IT finished installing the discrete mirror feed synced to the off-grid surveillance room, he thought he was ready to finally catch Damien in the act. But when Ava stepped in, everything Leo had prepared unraveled. He wasn't a voyeur, he wasn't careless, he wasn't someone who stared at strangers through glass, but in that moment he forgot the investigation, forgot the war he was fighting, and saw only her. She wasn't like the women who walked the halls of his world in red lipstick and ulterior motives. She was soft, where the world had turned hard. Her shyness wasn't staged, her grace wasn't rehearsed. She moved like someone who thought no one was watching, and that honesty pierced him in a place he'd buried beneath contracts and legacy. In another world they would have never met. Leo never attended company galas unless forced. Ava never even got close to the C-suite elevators. But fate had its own map that night, and a mistaken room key became the start of a ripple that would turn everything upside down. Outside the city was alive with noise and light, but inside the suite was a quiet tension neither of them knew how to name. Ava had no idea a silent observer stood behind the mirrored wall meant for betrayal, and Leo had no idea the girl who had just unknowingly exposed herself was about to expose something far deeper in him. The hotel, Lancaster Private, wasn't open to the public. It was corporate-owned, exclusive to high-ranking executives and secretive meetings. It wasn't somewhere people like Ava stayed, and yet somehow she ended up at the center of a battle for power between two billionaires who didn't believe in accidents. And as the city kept moving beneath them, something in the air shifted, something inevitable, electric and undeniable had begun, and neither of them would walk away from it, unchanged. Leo didn't sleep that night, not because of guilt, but because of confusion. He replayed the footage again and again, not in a way that breached her dignity, but as if searching for something he couldn't name. It wasn't her exposed skin that haunted him. It was the vulnerability on her face when she reached for her sweater, the way she moved without performance, unaware she was being seen. And he hated that she'd been watched at all, even by mistake. The next morning, he had the tech team shut down that feed and wipe the temporary storage, but the image remained with him, not visual but emotional, like a melody stuck in his chest. Ava, on the other hand, had no idea what had happened. She woke up in silk sheets, confused but safe. She'd been so exhausted from work that she barely remembered crashing after her bath. The suite had seemed off, but she chalked it up to corporate error. She left a polite message with front desk and checked out quietly, the incident fading into the noise of her routine. She didn't know that Leo had already started digging into who she was, not out of suspicion, but out of instinct. He wanted to know why her presence lingered, why her name now felt like a riddle he needed to solve. In the days that followed, they circled the same world without crossing paths. Ava returned to her cubicle life and accounts, while Leo balanced boardroom fires and silent wars. But each kept thinking about the other for reasons they couldn't explain. He saw her name once on an internal ledger and stared too long. She passed his photo in the company newsletter and paused without meaning to. They didn't speak until a week later, when an elevator malfunction changed everything. It was supposed to be a regular fire drill, but the timing overlapped with a meeting change, and Ava found herself alone in an express elevator that stopped abruptly between floors. Moments later, a voice crackled in through the speaker and asked if she was okay. She replied yes, but her voice was small, and Leo heard it from the control room down below. He'd been inspecting infrastructure issues himself that day, something about the elevator software updates being compromised, and he didn't trust reports that came wrapped in spin. He didn't know it was her until the name flashed on the service panel, Ava Mitchell. And then something in him shifted. He took the maintenance stairwell 2 floors up and keyed open the emergency latch himself. When the doors slid open, she blinked in surprise, expecting a technician, but finding the CEO instead. He wore no suit jacket, sleeves rolled and a hint of sweat on his collar, and for the first time she saw him as something other than a headline. She mumbled an apology, unsure why she felt like the one at fault. He smiled faintly and said, "Sometimes the system needs to get stuck before it finds the right floor." She blinked again, puzzled by his calmness and strangely poetic phrasing. He offered his hand. She took it, and in that brief contact, the world shifted a fraction. Not dramatically, but enough for both of them to notice the tremor beneath the ordinary. After that, it wasn't an instant romance. It was moments stitched together slowly, quietly, like threads pulled in secret. He'd pass her in the lobby and offer a nod. She'd bring an extra cup of coffee to the accounting floor and leave it for an anonymous recipient. He guessed it was her. When the lid had a smiley face drawn in pen, she never admitted it. They played this game of distance and proximity, pretending not to orbit when gravity said otherwise. One night, after hours, she stayed late to finalize reports, her screen flickering under office lamplight. Leo walked past on his way out and stopped when he saw her through the glass. Something pulled him in, a magnetic ache that made no sense. He knocked gently. She looked up, startled, but smiled. He asked if she needed help. She joked that unless he was a spreadsheet wizard, she was beyond saving. He stepped inside anyway. They worked side by side in silence, numbers and formulas filling the air, but the tension was elsewhere, beneath the surface, in the way their shoulders almost brushed, or how her laugh made his chest tighten. When they finally closed the laptop, she thanked him. He said, "I owed you." She frowned, confused. He added, "For trusting the elevator." She smiled at that, not knowing the truth was much heavier than that metaphor. Still, they didn't cross lines, not yet, but they came close. At a corporate charity gala, Ava was invited by accident or perhaps divine misfiling. She almost didn't go. Didn't have a dress, didn't believe she belonged, but her manager insisted. Someone dropped out and the table had an empty seat. She showed up in a borrowed gown and nerves that almost made her turn back at the door. Leo saw her before anyone else, standing near the entrance like she was trying to disappear into the wallpaper. He walked over without thinking, ignoring greetings from senators and moguls, stopping only when he reached her side. She turned, startled, and said, "You shouldn't waste your time here," he replied. "Maybe this is the only place time feels like mine." They danced once, not gracefully but sincerely, and when the string quartet swelled, he whispered, "Have we met before? That night in the elevator?" She looked at him for a long second, then said, "Maybe in a dream, where I didn't belong in your world," he said. "Or maybe mine never made sense until you entered it." Their connection wasn't built on flirtation. It was a quiet recognition, the kind that makes you feel seen even when fully clothed and surrounded by hundreds. They never touched beyond the hand he offered, but everything about them screamed intimacy, unspoken, fragile, real. Yet the shadows around Leo grew darker. Damien was making bolder moves, using ghost accounts and third-party fronts to mask illegal dealings. Leo suspected Ava had access to files Damien wanted to disappear. That's when he started pulling away, not because he didn't feel anything, but because he felt too much. He assigned her to a project meant to distance her from the fallout, gave her quiet praise through intermediaries, but stopped showing up himself. She thought she'd done something wrong. She told herself not to care. But her chest ached in ways spreadsheets couldn't explain. He, meanwhile, watched her from a distance, torn between wanting to protect her and needing her to stay far away from the fire that was coming. The sweet incident still haunted him, not because of the surveillance, but because it felt like fate had dropped her into his war, unarmed, innocent, and he couldn't allow that, not when Damien was capable of destroying anything that threatened his climb. But love doesn't listen to logic, and walls built to protect sometimes become the very thing that suffocates. The more Leo pulled away, the more she searched for understanding, and the more she searched, the closer she came to discovering the secret behind the glass, the truth that would shatter everything, because she would find out, eventually, that he had seen her first in a moment not meant to be shared, and that truth would either destroy them or bind them forever. Ava had always trusted her instincts, not because they were flawless, but because they had been her only compass in a world that often spun too fast. But something didn't feel right lately. Not about her job or her workload or even Leo's sudden silence, but about the way people looked at her in the office, the way conversations paused when she passed, how files she needed suddenly went missing, or how meetings were rescheduled without notice. It was like being watched, or being weighed by invisible scales she didn't understand. She tried to ignore it at first, focusing on her work, burying herself in numbers and late nights. But the more she tried to stay in her lane, the more she noticed cracks appearing in the walls around her. One afternoon, she received an email with no subject line, just a PDF attachment labeled Suite 59_clip. She hesitated before opening it, but curiosity won over caution, and what she saw made her stomach drop. It was a silent video file, black and white, grainy but clear enough she recognized the suite immediately. And then she saw herself, undressing slowly, unaware, vulnerable, her hands fumbling with her cardigan. She watched herself step into the room, thinking she was alone, and then the feed cut out, replaced by a pause screen and the words, "You were never alone." She closed the laptop, heart racing, cheeks burning. For a moment she couldn't breathe. The video had no timestamp, no watermark, but it wasn't hard to guess what it meant. The realization hit like ice down her spine. The mirror, the suite, the feeling she couldn't shake that night. Someone had been watching her. She didn't sleep. Instead, she replayed every interaction, every strange look, every pause in conversation, and one name kept floating to the surface. Leo. It didn't make sense, or maybe it did too much. He'd been kind, almost gentle, but distant in a way that felt deliberate. Had he known about this? Had he seen it? Was he the one watching, or was he trying to protect her from whoever was? The next day, she marched into IT pretending to request help with her account. But while the tech ran diagnostics, she scanned the screen over his shoulder and noted internal video logs tagged with room numbers and dates. Suite 59 had 6 entries, all recently deleted, and the admin user ID was encrypted under a generic alias, but the server's IP address linked back to a restricted subnetwork reserved for executive access. Her hands trembled when she left. She didn't want it to be true, but part of her already knew. She called in sick, something she never did, and spent the entire evening trying to trace the digital trail. What she found confirmed everything. The mirror wasn't a design feature, it was a surveillance point, and it had been used at least 3 times in the past 2 months. Always booked under shell names, always billed to internal company budgets routed through a dummy subsidiary. Leo's name never appeared directly, but the finance requests were signed off by someone in his office. Someone named Evelyn, his chief of staff. Ava had met her once in the elevator, tall, composed, and always watching. The pieces didn't fit perfectly, but they didn't have to. She saw enough to realize the truth was far bigger than her. She didn't confront him right away. Part of her wanted to, storm into his office, demand answers, demand apologies, but another part needed to understand why. She needed to know if it was betrayal or mistake, cruelty or protection. So she waited, and the universe didn't make her wait long. 2 days later, she received a call from someone named Aaron Wexler, an internal investigator posing as a legal compliance officer. He asked to meet off-site, discreetly, said he had information related to an internal leak and needed someone he could trust. She didn't know why he chose her, until he handed her a folder and said, "You weren't supposed to be in that suite." Inside the folder were more video stills, not just of her but of others, including Damien Lancaster, Leo's half-brother. Aaron explained what Leo had been doing, not in detail, but enough to draw a map. Leo had been tracking Damien's activities, suspecting him of corporate espionage, and the suite had been modified with a mirror feed to gather evidence. Ava's booking had been an accident, a clerical mishap that sent her into the wrong room on the wrong night. But by the time anyone realized it, the camera had already recorded too much. "And Leo?" she asked, her voice tight. "Did he watch it?" Aaron paused, then said, "Only once, to make sure it was you. Then he had it shut down." The words brought little comfort, but what followed did. He also fired the tech who forwarded it to anyone else and forced the deletion protocol before you were even aware. He tried to protect you after the fact. I can't say if that makes it better or worse, but it's what happened. Ava walked home in silence, heart heavy with a truth that didn't have clean edges. Leo hadn't violated her privacy intentionally, but he hadn't stopped it either. He'd allowed the possibility, and that shadow lingered, yet now she saw his silence differently, not as detachment, but shame, not rejection, but restraint. The next morning, she found a note on her desk. Unsigned, short, simple. "I never should have seen you that way, not like that, not then, but I haven't been able to stop seeing you since." It was his handwriting. She recognized the sharp edges of his L's, the way he slanted the E, and beneath the paper was a second envelope, this one with a keycard and an address. She went, not because she forgave him, but because she needed to see the full picture. And what she found wasn't a confrontation. Leo stood in front of her, not behind a desk or beside a boardroom table, but in a private space, no cameras, no glass, just silence and sunlight. And for the first time he looked like a man, not a myth. He told her everything, how he'd grown up under the constant pressure of image and power, how Damien had stolen from the company, from their father, and how he had no choice but to fight dirty to catch him, and how her accident shook him more than any lawsuit ever had. "I've spent years watching people lie, Ava, but you walked into that room and didn't even realize how honest you were," he said. "I saw someone I wasn't supposed to see, and I haven't stopped regretting it since." She listened, didn't speak, just watched him with eyes that held equal parts pain and possibility. Then she whispered, "If I'd known it was you watching, I don't know if I would have been more scared or more disappointed." He nodded, accepting the sting, then said, "You weren't supposed to be there, but maybe you were supposed to be the one thing I couldn't predict." It wasn't a clean moment, not romantic or perfect, but it was real, and Ava left with more questions than answers, but with one certainty. The man behind the mirror wasn't the villain, but he wasn't yet the hero either, and somehow that made him more human, and for the first time she allowed herself to hope. Because the truth had come out, not as a bomb, but as a wound, open and bleeding but capable of healing, and perhaps, just perhaps, love could begin not in perfection, but in the breaking. The night Damien made his move, Hollywood-style betrayal unfurled in the boardroom overlooking the city. But Ava only heard the echo of her name, tied to rumor scandal and stolen data. And when she rushed into the office, harsh fluorescent light showed her the worst version of Leo standing before a crowd of investors, directors, and journalists, Damien at his side smirking triumphantly as he pressed evidence into the table. She staggered at the sight of footage showing her face on screen, her vulnerability already weaponized against Leo's credibility. Ava felt betrayal cut deeper than she ever imagined. Leo's voice echoed hollow as he denied accusations, tried to reassure the room that he had nothing to hide, but his eyes flickered to the audience and he saw doubt mingling with expectation, and he remembered Ava standing in Suite 59, unaware, and suddenly she became lifeline and anchor, and confession rolled off his tongue as he revealed the truth about the mirror, the purpose of the surveillance, the accidental intrusion, and how he had tried to delete the footage before anyone else saw it. Room fell silent, and against Damien's orchestrated storm of whispers and nods, Leo had stepped into the eye of a hurricane. His confession making him vulnerable, but also altering the battlefield. Damien slammed the table as he accused Leo of deceit, manipulation, and misuse of company funds. But Leo raised a hand, his voice calm, although his heart pounded harder than ever. He laid out the timeline. The shell company's explosive allegations against Damien's network of secret accounts, and he produced the recording Ava had given him moments. She never knew she'd recorded, her voice trembling, but honest, speaking to an unknown listener about suspicious financial flows from suppliers to ghost entities that traced directly to Damien. The room erupted like a wave of water crashing on a ship. Everyone spoke at once, lawyers, directors, media cameras flashing, and in the chaos, Ava realized she held a position of power she never asked for but had earned through courage and clarity. She felt Leo's hand brush hers under the table, and in that touch she found comfort and resolve. Damien's face turned pale, artificial charm gone, and in that moment he knew his empire was collapsing. Leo pressed forward, calling for formal suspension of Damien alongside an internal probe, and requested Ava be present as a witness. As he spoke her name with pride, not shame, and her presence calmed him, gave purpose to his fight, and before she knew it, Ava stood shoulder to shoulder with Leo as they walked out of that room, facing flashing lights and murmuring crowd, and they both knew there was no going back. The world had seen them both stripped bare of secrets and pretenses. As the media storm broke, Leo arranged a press conference held on the hotel's rooftop terrace, dress code understated, but presence poised. He stood beside Ava, with his arm lightly across her back. Her face lifted toward the flashes as he spoke through a microphone, promising full transparency, rebuilding trust, and turning the betrayal into a watershed moment for corporate integrity. He looked into her eyes, and in that moment they shared acknowledgement of what they had survived, what they had discovered about themselves and each other. A few hours later, Ava received a call, her mother distraught tears, explaining their small apartment had been vandalized, houses of sponsors pressured to sever ties, whispers of scandal reached beyond boardrooms to her personal life. She learned what comes for one reaches the other, and she realized the battle they had chosen was choosing them, body and soul. Leo arrived at her door before she could process the news. He offered no words, just a look that said she would not face this alone. She leaned against him, tears and strength collapsing into each other under the glow of city lights. And in that embrace, they found a momentary haven. The next morning, a hearing was scheduled. Damien's empire froze, accounts were seized, investigators swarmed the hotel, and Leo and Ava worked side by side, preparing statements, giving interviews. Their partnership dissolved barriers between them, anything but professional. It was humanity meeting another soul, broken and forging something new. That night, as boarding cars lined the street, photographers captured Leo leaving another statement, but this time something fell from his pocket onto the pavement, illuminated by flash cameras. It was a small piece of patterned fabric soaked in tears and blood, and Ava recognized it as the scarf she wore the night she caught Leo's eye in Suite 59. It was a symbol of vulnerability, trust, fate, and the moment she realized there was no erasing what happened, nothing they could deny. In the empty hotel lobby, they met outside the presidential suite. Elevator doors shushed open, and Leo faced her, voice gentle but weary, saying, "There is one more thing I have to ask," as he pulled from inside his jacket a plain silver box. Her breath caught, and inside was not a ring, but a USB drive. He said, "Keep it and use it for whatever comes next." She looked at him confused, and he explained it contained copies of every evidence, logs, interviews, records, even parts that connect them together in partnership and in life, not as boss or junior employee, but as people who chose truth, courage, connection. She touched the drive, held his hand quietly, saying, "Thank you." And then, in that moment, they didn't need words to agree on what was next. They stepped into the elevator, and he pressed the call button. The doors whispered closed around them, and though the glass was thick and cameras dotted the lobby, they felt unseen. free, facing possible, uncertain, but real future. They had survived the lie, watched the betrayal, revealed the truth, and now they would decide whether to rebuild together or stand apart, two voices stronger than one. But in that silence, heavy with promise, they both knew the most powerful moment had already happened. They had trusted beyond the mirror and faced the storm side by side. 6 months passed since the storm in the boardroom and the rooftop confession. Ava and Leo carved out a fragile routine amid the aftermath of betrayal and renewal. He supported her dream while she steadied his fiercely guarded heart. But both knew shadows lingered in corners of trust they feared to revisit. Ava moved into a modest apartment closer to the hotel where she worked part-time crafting interior concepts for boutique spaces. She was fueled by purpose but haunted by loss of anonymity. Leo resumed his role publicly, stronger yet quieter. The glare of headlines dimmed, but the weight of expectations grew heavier. They spoke late nights on the hotel terrace, overlooking the skyline. She would tell him small details of her day, her frustrations, her excitement when a concept clicked, and he listened as if each word was evidence of her existence, not as collateral damage, but as life in full color. Their bond deepened, if softly, no grand declarations or public displays, but in the way he sent her coffee each morning in the lobby, ways she left notes in his dressing room acknowledging his courage. They were two souls weaving themselves into a shared rhythm, without rush, without fanfare. Then came the unexpected invitation, an exclusive benefit gala hosted by International Arts Council. It correlated with a new wing opening at the hotel, where Ava had designed the concept, and Leo was to introduce the exhibit. In a speech put forward by the trustees, she accepted not for ambition, but because this was her art, her design, that would be recognized, and he offered to escort her, though she'd insisted she could handle it alone. That night she took her place by the exhibit as champagne flutes passed, and AI-generated holograms danced across installations created to evoke themes of transparency and reflection, thematic homage to her journey, and Leo joined her after his speech, applause still echoing. He asked if she was ready for the moment when the spotlight would turn away from him to her. She nodded, heart pounding, until the gallery lights dimmed and the hologram shifted, revealing, across the gallery wall, a floor-to-ceiling rendition of Suite 59 mirror, overlaid with footage of that night, at first shifting shapes, then scenes of vulnerability, fear, courage, and intimacy, and her breath caught. He stepped forward quietly beside her, helping her steady the screen, transitioned to show her design sketches, before fading into an image of her holding Leo's hand in the boardroom. A hush fell, and then Leo spoke in soft, confident voice. This exhibition is not just about art or architecture or corporate achievement. It is about transparency, about facing truths we may prefer hidden, and standing together when the world demands we stand alone. He took her hand and looked into her eyes and said, "This night is yours, not mine." Ava felt tears slip down as she looked around at audience, moved, some wiping eyes, others leaning in as she realized the room had been invited to witness not her mistake, but her growth, not her shame, but her power. Then the lights went down further and a spotlight illuminated a sculpture in the center of the room, a delicate mirror framed in silver, reflecting their faces as one. He whispered to her, "This mirror has no glass, only truth, and in its reflection, we stand transparent together." She looked into the mirror and saw herself not as the girl who stepped into a trap, but as the woman who chose courage over collapse. At that moment, she realized Leo knew every layer of her story and chose to stand with her, not in spite of the past, but because of it. After the gala, they slipped out to the terrace. She leaned against the railing, pressing her cheek to his sleeve. The city hummed below. She whispered that she loved the exhibit, the message, but said little else. Leo took a breath, the same measure of restraint he'd worn for months. She asked, was he okay? He paused, then said, There is something I want to give you later, something that might have changed everything if I'd given it sooner." She nodded, no questions, eyes steady, and he simply said, "Wait for me upstairs." And she smiled, though her heart bolted because trust felt both fragile and eternal. They entered Leo's suite, and he pointed toward a small minimalist table. There lay an unassuming white envelope, inside a fine hand-drawn sketch of the suite mirror. But on its back, words in his handwriting: "This is what I saw before I ever saw you. This is what you taught me to see." Under that was a small jewelry pouch. She unzipped it, revealing a delicate silver necklace pendant, shaped like a mirror, engraved with coordinates of Suite 59 and the words "Truth only if faced together." He fastened it around her neck and whispered, "Stay transparent with me." She closed her eyes, pressing lips to his chest. Gratitude, hope, relief, and something new, fear folded into courage. Then came the night they'd feared. Damien had been released under appeal. His attorneys claimed he was misunderstood, brotherly rivalry, not malice, and without the same level of proof, some charges fell away. Leo received news that investigations would reopen, and for a moment the world tilted. Ava reached for him and said whatever was coming, they could face it. And he looked at her, the man who built glass walls for truth, looked at her and said, together, they spent the night talking, never sleeping, about futures, about fears, about the world they wanted to build, one based on real connection, transparency, accountability. Morning broke with the message his phone lit up, a gallery request. Her exhibit concept was being considered for permanent installation at the corporate headquarters, New Wing multi-city rollout. She looked at him, improbable. He just nodded and said, "You earned that." Their love had become a foundation. It didn't erase past trauma, but it held them steady when tides surged and headlines roared. They learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness, and truth wasn't weapon but bridge. And months later, when the news broke that Damien pleaded guilty to all charges, admitting he abused trust for power, Leo and Ava stood before the press. He placed her hand over his chest. She did the same over her heart. They spoke as one, saying healing comes when we face truth and choose each other, and behind them was that mirror pendant, glowing in the morning light. It remained a symbol not just of how they met, but of choice redemption, unity, not perfect love, but love chosen every day, through transparency, accountability, commitment, and, in the quiet after the crowd dispersed, they walked back down the terrace, side by side, hand in hand, no cameras, no glass between them, only trust and the promise that whatever came next, they would face side by side. Years later, as the city glowed beneath a sky touched with the soft hues of dawn, Ava stood by the window of the new Design Institute, named after the Lancaster Foundation for Transparency and Innovation, her fingers brushing the pendant still resting against her collarbone, the mirror charm warm from the sun. She turned as Leo entered the room, quietly dressed in one of his signature white shirts, sleeves slightly rolled, his hair tousled from wind, but his eyes steady on her. They didn't speak immediately. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer filled with doubt or fear. It was rich with understanding. It held the weight of everything they had built, from the ashes of misunderstanding and shadows of betrayal. She looked at him, remembering not just the first night they met across that invisible barrier, but all the nights that followed, the ones filled with questions, long walks, soft laughter, quiet apologies, gentle forgiveness, and love so real it didn't need permission to exist. He walked over to her and wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close as she leaned into his chest, her breath steady, his heartbeat a rhythm that felt like home. He whispered, "You changed everything. You made me believe in truth again." She smiled against his shirt and said, "No, we chose it together, and that made all the difference." Behind them in the open gallery space, a group of students from the foundation were setting up the new installation, the same concept Ava first envisioned, now reimagined by a new generation, inspired not by scandal, but by the courage to face their own stories in full light. The centerpiece was still the same, a reflective sculpture without glass, standing as a reminder that mirrors don't lie, but people must choose what they see. The world didn't forget their story, and Ava didn't ask it to. She gave interviews, sometimes not for fame, but to show others how resilience looks when given room to breathe, how trust can be rebuilt from fragments, and how love does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be chosen again and again and again. As the ceremony began outside, and the soft murmur of guests filled the halls, Leo turned to her and asked, "Ready?" and she nodded her hand in his, firm yet gentle. They stepped forward together toward the crowd that once watched them with skepticism, now with admiration. Not because they were flawless, but because they were honest. The applause rose not for a couple who survived chaos, but for a story that reminded them all that healing is possible when truth is faced, love is possible when walls fall, and even something broken like a mirror can become the beginning of something whole. And in that moment, with light pouring through the tall windows, with hands intertwined and their reflections shining not from behind a secret wall, but from the open glass of the building they built together, they knew they had not just rewritten their story, they had redefined what love could mean.